Shortly after my 10th birthday, I joined the Boys' Brigade, and for the next 4 years, membership of the BB fully satisfied my gregarious instincts. I attended not only the Friday parades, for which brasses had to be cleaned, leather polished and piping whitened, but also the Sunday morning Bible class, the Wednesday evening prayer meeting, the Thursday evening Morse and semaphore class, and the Monday evening band practice, at which I thumped a side drum. One of the reasons for this almost fanatical punctiliousness was that it satisfied my natural human craving to belong to a group. Another was that the strongly ethical tone of the BB, so highly exemplified, not only in the captain and the young staff officers, but also, to a lesser degree, in many of the boys for whom I had a far stronger feeling of brotherhood than for my foul-mouthed associates at school. But the strongest reason was the one of which I was then least aware. Among the members was a friendly, affable, good-looking boy about 2 years senior to me, and for him I at once developed an ardent affection. It was one of those dumb adolescent attachments which nobody seems to notice, least of all its object. But though we met several times a week and were on the best of terms, we never became close friends. Strangely enough, this was a deprivation which I never felt. Being utterly happy merely to see his face and hear his voice, it never occurred to me to desire a more intimate relationship.
It was summertime in Surrey, and the Friends of the Western Buddhist Sangha was holding its first retreat. It was led by the Sangha's founder, Sangharakshita.
Because there were so few people on the retreat, I had quite a bit of personal contact with Bhante. In fact, he seemed to be very keen on me, sort of made a beeline for me. We just chatted, and he told me a bit about his life in Kalimpong, and would answer any questions about the Dharma that I would ask. And Stephen Parr was also on that retreat, as well as Terry Delamare. So I made very good contact with two good friends of Bhante on that same retreat.
After an absence of 20 years, the Venerable Stafira Sangharakshita alighted onto the London tarmac, was driven through western suburbs, and without so much as a cup of tea, stood in front of an astonished audience.
At first, the questions were fairly routine, but then a young man suddenly demanded, "Why have you come to England?" His tone was belligerent, even challenging, as if my presence was unwelcome and standing in need of explanation. This gave me the opening I needed, and I therefore replied at some length, giving an account of my life and work in India, emphasizing that I appreciated all schools of Buddhism, and making it clear that I had come principally in order to bring British Buddhists together. My frankness seemed to give general satisfaction, and when the meeting ended, there was a more relaxed and friendly atmosphere in the room than there had been at the beginning. My work in the West had begun.
Good morning, everyone. It's Patricia Hughes in London, and in a few moments we'll hear the time signal for 7 o'clock.
I was living in 1964 near Hampstead. There was a plaque, and I thought, well, I'd just go and see what it's like. Sangharakshita was standing up, giving a talk. It made a lot of sense to me.
My life at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara was a very busy one, consisting mainly of taking classes, delivering lectures, and seeing people individually. And those activities usually filled up my week very well. I also visited quite regularly all the little outlying Buddhist groups up and down the country. I tried to see every one of them at least every 2 or 3 months, and in those days there were a couple of dozen of them. They were very small, but they always gave me a very warm welcome. I gave courses of lectures not only at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara itself, but at the Buddhist Society, at the invitation of Christmas Humphreys, and in various other venues in and around London.
Ruth Walsh, the cheerful wife of the English Sangha Trust chairman, accompanied the Stavira to his lectures.
4.5 months after being back in London, I was giving lectures at the Buddhist Society, at the Buddhist Vihara and Berg House in Hampstead, and at the College of Psychic Science. South Kensington is a very different place from Hampstead. Ruth Walsh and other friends from the Vihara were running the bookshop and recording my talk. We had a full house for Buddhism and the problem of death.
According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, if one is not afraid, then at that moment one can, as it were, unite oneself with that reality as the radiance of one's own true mind at its deepest level.
At the end of it, a tall, well-dressed young man who'd been taking notes approached me.
Terry says to him, "I know what you're talking about because I have experienced the white light."
The Buddhist quite honestly and quite straightforwardly regards the Buddha as the greatest of all spiritual teachers that have ever lived. But at the same time, he is quite prepared to respect, even to admire, other religious teachers.
I invited Terry Delamare to come and see me one evening at the Vihara. Terry was depressed. His depression had a long history, going back to his lonely and unhappy childhood.
As a boy, his father ran a butcher's shop, and unhappily, Terry's job each Saturday was to kill the bunnies. He blamed his parents for letting him leave school early, which left him with a sense of inferiority. As far as his parents could see, Terry had an enviable life. He had a wife, a child, a bubble car, and a fashionable job.
Campbell's cream of chicken soup, made with cream.
Terry had a successful job in advertising and a 5-year-old daughter, whom he saw every other weekend when he visited his parents in Ilford. If anyone asked after his wife, he had to say she was quite well, thank you, as though they were still living together. This was a piece of pretense that revolted him. He therefore returned from these visits tired and depressed.
Sunsilk Beauty Shampoo gives your hair the sunsilk look.
Midnight, and the new year is born.
I had been reflecting on my friendships. The closest to me were Thich Thien Chau, a scholarly monk who often stayed with me in Kalimpong, Eric, who would be the first Englishman to be ordained in England by an Englishman, and Terry.
When Terry's daughter was 2 years old, his marriage blew sky high, and he sought help from an alternative psychiatrist. Dr. David Cooper, a colleague of R.D. Laing, prescribed psychoanalysis, which over 2 years cured his lack of sexual responsiveness. This was followed by treatment at his Villa 21 project.
As Dr. Capel administered the ether, so my mind seemed to ascend level and level of detachment and serenity, along with an intense love and understanding of the people around me.
Terry recalled he reached the level of total detachment and oblivion, a fluorescent darkness, only at the moment of descent back into ordinary consciousness. he was left convinced a human being would struggle to evolve over many lifetimes, or else simply see the truth pure and unadulterated, whether by means of drugs, fasting, or meditating. Terry had seen the pure white light, and I, at the age of 17, had awoken to the truth of the teaching contained in the Diamond Sutra. Tathagata Subhuti is another name for what never begins. And how so? No beginning Subhuti is the highest truth. Subhuti, if anyone should claim, the Tathagata, the Arhat, the fully enlightened one realized unexcelled perfect enlightenment, such a claim would be untrue. To me, the Diamond Sutra was not new. I had known it and believed it and realized it ages before, and the reading of the sutra, as it were, awoke me to the existence of something I had forgotten.
Bhante talks about Terry and himself having this very strong spiritual relationship, where they both had very strong, in Bhante's words, transcendental experiences, and had to come down from them.
Neither Terry nor I had been able to remain permanently on that higher level. But though both had descended, it was as though we had descended on either side of a veil that was sufficiently transparent for us to be able to communicate with each other through it without too much difficulty. I wanted to see a little more of my native land, and Terry offered to drive me in the little bus, as he called his doormobile, which, besides being capable of sleeping 4 persons, contained a miniature kitchen and sundry other conveniences. As soon as dawn broke, I sat up and looked out at these enormous sarsens and reflected on the skills that must have gone into shaping and positioning them more than 4,000 years ago. The key to the nature of our friendship was perhaps to be found in the word affinity, which I had used in one of my diary entries a couple of months after Terry and I met. My diary: long talk until 2 o'clock, a quite exceptional person, felt very strong affinity. The affinity was a spiritual, even a transcendental one. Yesterday's meeting of the Sangha Trust had been a stormy one. Tempers had been lost and harsh words had been spoken, which left me with the impression that the Dharma was the last thing anyone wanted to know about. I am seated with a number of other people. In front of me on the table is a collection of jewels. I feel rather sad because no one is interested. Suddenly Dada Rinpoche appears, smiling, and looks at the jewels, whereupon I feel happy. Terry had just moved to a larger flat. I had only to walk a little way, and in 15 minutes I would be at the flat and enveloped in a profound silence that was broken only by the occasional flushing of a distant toilet. There were always 2 buildings, the 2 being connected by a secret path. One was open to the public and much frequented, and it was where I usually stayed. The other building was private. Few people were even aware of its existence. Sometimes I'd even forgotten myself. Once again I found myself making my way to what Eric, more truly than he realized, jocularly referred to as the other vihara. My diary: got up at about midday, having spent the morning talking. Terry was feeling depressed after being given an alcoholic send-off by his former colleagues. They could not understand why he was leaving the advertising agency, and he had been unable to deliver the speech he had prepared. My diary: about 1 o'clock, went and had lunch at the Indo-Pak. For the first time in nearly 20 years, I went out not wearing the robes of a Buddhist monk. Terry was pleased to see me in civilian clothes. I wanted to be lost in the crowd, to be the observer rather than the observed. His tweed sports jacket fitted me perfectly.
So you get a sort of feeling out this is really moving against the stream, and it probably shocked the people who ran the Sangha Trust and the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, that this monk was actually not spending all the time at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, spending quite a lot of time, with Terry. And this is, I suppose, how all the opposition started.
Terry, along with his friend Alan, attended their first retreat amongst ruins of the English Civil War. Ruth, as editor of the Sangha Journal, recalled her experience. Meditating Among the Ruins by Ruth Walsh. The day started with the sounding of the gong at 6:30, and after breakfast, our group silently crept up the stairs leading to the Venerable Stavira's tower room, where we always started and finished the day with puja, a little devotional Mahayana service, which included the taking of the 3 refugees and the 5 precepts.
In the evenings, we had either a live talk by Ruth or a tape of one of my lectures. Each morning of the retreat, Terry and I meditated on Vajrasattva. For Terry, it was a sincere attempt to dispel the clouds obscuring the pure light of the mind.
The rest of the day was spent studying or walking quietly amongst the shrubs and bluebells in the extensive grounds.
My diary. Long walk. Mutual revelation of loneliness. Profound and poignant. We were both citizens of another realm, though I did not feel I'd known Terry in a former earthly existence, nor did he entertain any such idea with regard to me. Neither did I feel that in Terry I had miraculously found my platonic other half. I've never felt that way about anyone, though Terry still hoped to find the ideal partner who would enable him to experience himself more fully and function more effectively.
There was a constant stream of understanding and friendship between the members of the group and between teacher and pupils. We really lived every minute of these days in such harmony with everyone and everything around us as I had never experienced before.
The following day was Ruth's birthday. Terry and Alan put their creative skills to work making a card, and putting this along with a big bowl of pink rhododendrons in front of her place at table. We were all seated and waiting when she arrived for breakfast. Her artless joy was reflected in the faces of all around her.
Now, since I spoke here last, I spent a week at Biddulph. Came back in the afternoon. I found our engineer, Mr. Reville, working on his tape recording machine. He remarked, with his usual dry humour, that now that you've had a week in the deep freeze up at Biddulph, this should be a very profound lecture.
Terry never treated me as a monk, and took to addressing me as Dennis, which scandalised 1 or 2 good lay Buddhists.
This friendship with Terry and the way they conducted their friendship was very much an aspect of moving against the stream. Because he would say, after the puja, for instance, after the puja, Terry and I slipped away, and they'd go in maybe to Terry's dormobile and talk until midnight or after midnight.
On the last day of the retreat, Terry and I slipped out after the evening puja and drove to Rudyard Lake, and there passed the night in the little bus. Next day, Terry was driving to Spain, where he was going camping with Vivian, his girlfriend. Before he left, I hung my rosary around his neck and asked him to wear it while he was away. We both were much affected by the thought of our impending separation. I realised that if anything untoward was to happen, I should feel I had suffered an irreparable loss.
Behind the bookshops of Charing Cross Road lies an area colloquially known as 7 Dials, consisting of little streets with little shops radiating in 7 directions. One such street is Monmouth Street, and one such shop is Sakura. By chance, Sangharakshita discovered the shop, its owner, Emile Boyne, a Japanese lacquer restorer, and a white porcelain Kuan Yin for his mother's sideboard. Sangharakshita spent his birthday on the Essex coast with Mother. On their last morning together, they sat on the front, chatting and gazing at the longest pleasure pier in the world. Back at the Vihara, Terry's letter awaited.
My diary. He's all right. Big load off my mind. Can hardly imagine what future may bring.
Endless different people would get up and give their views on all sorts of different subjects. So it wasn't a bad beginning for anybody interested in Buddhism to get different people's views on what it was all about.
A few days into my second Buddhist Society summer school, Terry telephoned me to say he was back. We arranged to meet. For some time we could hardly speak, and we realised how deep a feeling we had come to have for each other. To me, it was almost as though Terry had been miraculously restored to life after being dead for 3 weeks.
Intimacy is so important, and I think this is what Bhante had obviously craved for, subconsciously, for many years. And when he found Terry, although it was not sexual, yet he got this satisfaction on that intimacy level, which he never had before.
I had asked Terry how far he was willing to drive me. As far as I liked, he replied. Could he drive me to India? Yes, he replied, his face lighting up. He could. Instead of going overland to India, we would go overland to Greece. We would be away for 2 months. We had on board 60 tins of minestrone and 60 tins of condensed milk. The 6th day of our journey began unpropitiously. Terry had not felt so depressed since he acknowledged he might never see his daughter again. This time his depression had a quite different cause. It was due to all the sightseeing we'd been doing. So much of what he had seen had no meaning for him. My diary. Saint Apollinare, first Bishop of Ravenna. Mosaics of quite unearthly beauty.
Terry was very, very depressed. I remember Bhante telling me that he said sometimes I sit opposite Terry, just pouring energy into him. But it doesn't really work.
My diary. Campsite near Campo Marino. Intense heat. We have nothing to do but cook, wash a few clothes, and read about Greece. High Zeus, Lord of Dodona, hear me, as one time you listened and did me honour, and smote the host of the Archaeans, so one more time bring to pass the wish that I pray for. We heard no whisperings from the leaves in which the oracle had had its seat. We sat in the welcome shade of a cluster of olive trees and read. I read about the mythology of Delphi, Terry, a book on Zen by D.T. Suzuki. After a while, I became aware that my friend was feeling very depressed, and we had what my diary terms a little talk. Apparently he was depressed because our being surrounded by the remains of an ancient civilization and culture, about which he knew very little, served to remind him of his lack of education, and thus to trigger those feelings of inferiority and inadequacy that were never far from the surface. As a result of our little talk, Terry regained his cheerfulness, and as it was now 4 o'clock, we repaired to the little bus to partake of the cups that cheer but not inebriate, generously laced with condensed milk. My diary. 9 a.m, Sunday, 3rd of July. We have reached our destination, Delphi. Although the oracle had been silent for more than 1,000 years, what I felt most about Delphi is that this was a holy place. Lagonissi. During the day we explored little rocky inlets, washed clothes, brewed tea, and heated up can after can of minestrone. Terry spent a good deal of time swimming, while I sat on a rock and read Plato's Apology of Socrates. It had become obvious that my work now lay in the West, and that sooner or later I would have to pay a visit to the land of the Buddha and take proper leave of my friends, disciples, and teachers there. Before we left Greece, I picked sprigs of thyme. The fragrance served to remind me of our holiday together.
Well, subsequently, Sangharakshita went away. So he disappeared, and after a while, I started looking for him. Well, in my mind, though.
To my great relief, Terry was in a much more positive frame of mind than he had been before our holiday. He said nothing about Gillian, his ex-wife, or about Fiona, his daughter, and I thought it best not to inquire. Do you think I shall meet my Dakini in India? He wanted to know. As Terry had first heard about Dakinis, when I told him about Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche and his Dakini, I could hardly deny their existence. I therefore replied non-committedly and said it was not impossible. Dear members and friends, after a very smooth and pleasant flight by Air India, Terry Delamare and I reached Bombay at 4:30 a.m. local time. I soon realised that Terry felt intimidated by our host, Dr. Dinsha K. Mehta. My old Parsi friend styled himself the Servant of Servants, and all activities of the Society of the Servants of God were conducted in strict accordance with the guidance that he received in meditation. This guidance came directly from God and was to be acted upon to the letter.
Terry's diary. Experience this void-like apathy.
Dr. Mehta was a very kind man and warmly supported my work amongst the ex-untouchable Buddhists. The first to appear at our host's Malabar Hill flat was Maheshkar, who, with Karuna, his wife, had organised hundreds of my lectures. Fortunately, Terry felt quite at home with the followers of Dr. Ambedkar. My diary. Meeting at Chawl, number 86. A happy, friendly atmosphere.
Terry's diary. Meeting in Chawl corridor. Took many pictures. Was garlanded.
It was a year since Terry resigned from his job, rented the other Vihara, and more recently helped make his friend's European tour a success. Whilst keeping an eye open for his Dakini, Terry's immediate project was to make a photographic record of the farewell tour.
My diary. At 7:15 p.m. went to Worli. Gave lecture on Buddhist meditation. Gathering slightly restless. Then to Patanchul. Spoke on 5 spiritual faculties.
Terry's diary. Bit brighter today. I really must make more intense effort, yet inwardly feel very reluctant.
My diary. Good quiet audience. About 150 people attended.
Meeting held in the open amongst chickens and insects. 4 speeches, mine included.
Very much to his astonishment, Terry found it less difficult to say a few words to 100 mostly illiterate Buddhists than it had been for him to make a farewell speech to colleagues.
Terry's diary. T just about coped. Evident D quite positive and determined.
Suffering from a bad cold, but Terry spoke briefly.
T fearful, retiring, and resistant.
On the last day in Pune, Terry and I did little as I was suffering from a sore throat. I read Plotinus.
Rats noisy in the night. Left for Nagpur at 8:30 p.m. Tearful goodbye.
Word travelled up the line, and at every station I was obliged to get down to deliver a short speech.
Miserable journey. Dee got out of train until midnight. Poor sleep.
Nagpur, 14th of October, 1:30 p.m. We were welcomed by my old lawyer friend Mr. Kulkarni, and then driven to the initiation ground. I was glad to be back again in Nagpur for the 10th anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar's conversion. The spot where he had recited the refuges and precepts is now marked by a large bust. At Sarnath we circumambulated the massive Dharmak Stupa, the spot where the Buddha gave his first teaching. Terry had been quite badly depressed and did not feel very much like seeing other people. Usually, after acknowledging that he felt depressed, I would gradually change the subject and start talking about something positive which was of interest to both of us. The depression, as he became more and more engrossed, would little by little subside of its own accord. We visited the Burmese temple, where I'd received my bhikshu ordination, and Nalanda Pali Institute, founded by my teacher, Venerable Kashyap. I was glad to receive Kashyapji's blessing upon my plan to return permanently to the West.
As in the peacock fable, Sangharakshita was about to find out whether he could digest poison or not.
On our arrival in Calcutta, I found letters waiting for me. Some friends informed me that the English Sangha Trust was trying to prevent my return to the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara. Whatever the explanation might be, a cloud had appeared on the horizon. One of the first letters to be opened on our arrival in Kalimpong was from George Goulstone, one of the directors of the English Sangha Trust.
In the opinion of the Trust and your fellow order members, your long absences from the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, together with your extramural activities, are not in accordance with the Theravada's high standards of discipline and ethics. The Trust has therefore decided to seek elsewhere for an incumbent. In doing so, they feel sure of having the agreement of the Sangha authorities in England.
When I had finished reading the letter, I asked Terry, "Do you know what this means?" "It means a new Buddhist movement." The words sprang spontaneously to my lips. Though I had long felt that the Buddhist movement in Britain might need a fresh impetus, I had never considered such a radical step before. I decided I would reply only when I had had time to think and to consult with Terry. Next morning, I sent an announcement to the New Statesman that my lectures on Buddhism would continue on my return.
At this season of peace and goodwill, it is the pleasure of the management and staff of this theatre to wish you all a most happy time.
After having tried a few alternatives to maybe get the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara reorganised, which we failed to do because we didn't have, in the end, voting powers or any real powers, we thought best to get out of it and start afresh.
Maurice Walsh, who did have power, located an earlier incumbent who was sporting a new name, was planning on getting married, and asked him to take up the reins again. Later, after a ceremony at the East Sheen Thai Temple, Richard Randall emerged as Kapilavaadu.
They must be satisfied with the foot of a tree for bed if necessary, and to live on the merest of medicines. Everyone is just a bhikkhu.
I told Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche about my work in England and about the difficulties that I would have to face. He assured me with a smile the difficulties were of little importance and would soon pass. As Terry and I were finishing breakfast, Kachu Rinpoche arrived, as he always did, unexpectedly. After lunch, he explained certain fundamentals of the Padmasambhava visualization, just as his celebrated guru, Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche, had instructed. Greatly as I appreciated being with my teachers and friends again, the thought of the letter from the English Sangha Trust was never far from my mind. After receiving a long letter from Christmas Humphreys, there was even more to think about. My diary: climb up to Observatory Hill. Photographs rather disappointing. Christmas Humphreys was appreciative of my magnificent work
for the Dharma. It is your public image that is in question. You have to face the depth and power of the English middle-class mind and its abhorrence of homosexuality.
This was the clearest indication I have yet received that the Trust decision has something to do with my friendship with Terry. Darjeeling was a more discreet place from which to cable a reply. Glad you realise no evidence, main allegation. Stop. Not interested image, interested enlightenment. Stop. No intention being sacrificed. Combination Hinayana sterility, British respectability. Stop. Not all your facts correct.
Think of her taking him.
Yes, just because a man any woman would like 1,000 times better was a little wild one night at a serenade.
What she minds was his making a clown of himself in her own front yard. Made her think
The trouble had started at the Buddhist Society's summer school as gossip amongst the old ladies of Kensington, as Dr. Konza called them, about my relationship with Terry. That relationship, it was alleged, was of homosexual nature.
His what? His comeuppance.
That was enough to send Maurice Walsh into a panic. Walsh, Galston, and as I already knew, the old ladies of Kensington, were staunch Theravadins all. Dado Rinpoche's eyes sparkled with intelligence, and I saw Terry regard him with respect. Over the next few weeks we worked together on the white Tara text the Rinpoche had given me years earlier. Yogi Chen lived as a hermit, rarely went out, and refused to consider himself a guru. Yet he was ready to share his knowledge and experience with the few allowed to visit him. He allowed Terry to take pictures of his tankas. Many of them depicted wrathful divinities in sexual union with their consorts. "Do you think I shall meet my Dakini today?" had been Terry's frequent cry during the early weeks of our tour. But now he was silent on the subject, as if realizing his hope of meeting her was an impossible dream. On the morning of the day of our departure, we paid our last visit to Dado Rinpoche. Though I was sorry to be leaving him, I knew I could never really be parted from him, any more than I could be parted from Yogi Chen or Kachu Rinpoche or any of my other teachers. Spiritually, they would always be with me, and I would always have their protection and blessing.
I bought a newspaper, and there was a little ad about a talk, but the talk was not at the Vihara anymore. It was somewhere in Covent Garden.
We had a little shrine room at Monmouth Street, built by our dear late friend Emil Boyne. So we all mucked in and tidied it up, got some old carpet somewhere and made it quite pleasant and nice seats, and he had this knack for little Japanese windows with Japanese paper in them, and the place was soon very attractive.
Now that I was no longer the incumbent of the Hampstead Vihara, I was free to devote myself to the creation of a new Buddhist movement. In the meantime, there was a lesson to be drawn from the trustee meeting 6 months earlier, at which Maurice Walsh had made his proposal to dismiss me. Walsh and Galston had voted for it, Alf and Mike against it, and Marcus, a non-Buddhist trustee, had voted with Walsh and Goldstone, a 3-2 majority in favour of Walsh's proposal. This meant that my dismissal had been the result of a deciding vote cast by a non-Buddhist member of what was ostensibly a Buddhist body. The lesson I drew was that a Buddhist organisation had to be controlled by Buddhists, and that it was not possible for it to be controlled by Buddhists unless all its members were Buddhists.
And to my amazement, I found Sangharakshita again, and I was ever so pleased. The people around in that kind of cave were very friendly and lovely. So I liked the atmosphere better than the Vihara, really. It was not so formal, you could ask questions.
In August 1967, Terry and I moved into a bigger flat on Highgate, West Hill. It consisted of 2 rooms and a kitchen. From the back window there was a view of Hampstead Heath. We walked in the grounds of Kenwood House and did a fair amount of reading. While Terry read Wilhelm Reich's The Function of the Orgasm, I read Porphyry's On Abstinence from Animal Food. Sometimes after a class, Terry and I would adjourn to As You Like It, where I would have a cup of tea and he his evening meal. Barry, the owner of the cafe, was a very thin, very camp man of about 35. He spent much of his time talking on the phone, for As You Like It doubled as a kind of theatrical agency, and there were usually 2 or 3 good-looking young actors lounging about.
We just chatted about this and that, and I think that's probably where I began to get to know who Banty was and what his kind of plans and dreams were.
Several of my friends in the early days of the FWBO were members of the English Mystical School of Painting, whom I had met at Goldsmiths College. They were a bit interested in Buddhism, but were mainly into the arts.
A map is a complete...
Well, you'll work it out and you'll see the planets go through the houses.
I used to hold what I called incense-burning parties with them at my flat. First was the sweet Indian incense, which I remembered from childhood. Then thin sticks of the Japanese incense, which reminded me of women's face powder. And then the healthful, invigorating scent of Tibetan incense, which reminded me of Kalimpong. At the very centre of things was blonde, beautiful Louis, in her long green dress, who officiated as priestess. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the room changed. There would be a kind of quiver in the air, and we would feel less and less inclined to talk. By the end of the evening, we would find ourselves in a state of altered consciousness that was both individual and collective. In the hippie jargon of those days, we were stoned. They all went off to New York, and I lost touch with them. One fine summer evening in 1968, I went down to Sakura to lead a meditation class. I arrived to find a cluster of people waiting for me on the pavement. One of them was a shabbily dressed young man who seemed to be the object of general disapproval.
Yes, there was a young American chap who I gather was sleeping there and in the shrine room. I didn't think he was supposed to be there, but he just happened to bed down there for a few nights and knocked a candle over and the place went up in flames.
He had had no time to dress and therefore emerged naked, and the clothes he was now wearing were some of Emil's old working clothes. Rather reluctantly, I offered to take him back to my flat. Over a drink and a snack, Carter, as the young American was called, told me a little about himself. He had left his comfortable middle-class home in California, and for the last few weeks he'd been hitching his way around Europe. "Shall I make you up a bed on the floor? "Or will you sleep with me?" I asked. "I'll sleep with you," was Carter's prompt reply, as he divested himself of Emil's paint-stained cast-offs. His well-proportioned body seemed made of gold rather than flesh. As soon as he was in bed, he snuggled up to me and I put my arm around him, saying, "Is it all right?" And although I could not see his face, I knew that he was grinning. We were being swept up on a wave of sexual ecstasy, such as I at least had not experienced before. How long we remained on it, I do not know, but when it subsided, I was left feeling deeply satisfied and went straight to sleep.
I think the first retreat one goes on is quite an experience. And communication exercises and silent days. The build-up of the meditation. Everybody went round sort of on cloud nine by the end of it. There's a lot of very good feeling one towards another at the end.
Just felt quite magical. There was just this incredible sort of stillness and presence around, and I immediately trusted him. I mean, even though I would be in a lot of physical pain, just the stillness of the energy that came from him would bring about that kind of calmness and a greater sense of awareness. You'd feel you were living in another state of consciousness, basically.
People, especially Buddhists, trying to meditate and live and grow on the path, need other people. We need a community.
It was on that retreat that Gotami asked me if I would like to move into a community, and somebody had the I Ching there, and we asked the I Ching whether I should move, and it said I should, and I should do it quickly, otherwise I'd slip into old ways and wouldn't do it. So yeah, I moved in there when I was 18 probably, left home, and that was the first Buddhist community.
Bhante was staying in the New Forest with Carter.
My landlady owned a caravan in the New Forest and agreed to rent it to me for a week. Arnada would be staying with us, and Mike would be paying us a day visit. Thus, for a day, I would enjoy the company of two of my closest friends.
We were camping. It was very beautiful weather, very warm.
Bhante was pretty nifty putting a tent up.
We met in the evening in a pub where we just drank Guinness. We just talked for hours.
It was a time of light and colour, of harmony and peace. From time to time, Carter and I wandered off on our own, just to get some exercise.
Carter is very easygoing, likeable chap, and he was a very good contact for me for getting dope.
Oh, he just seemed to be in his own world, and that was a very different world to the one that the rest of us were in, I think. I just remember this mass of blonde hair. He was quite tall, quite good looking in a hippie kind of way. That obviously Bhante made an unusual connection with.
He was obviously very into drugs. But he seemed, in a way, he didn't like particularly Buddhists coming up to Bhante's place. He seemed to be very sort of not really wanting us there. As if we were disturbing Bhante in some way in his eye. But I think he was quite a strange character to me. I was very straight then. I didn't know anything about drugs.
It was not long before Carter persuaded me to share a joint with him. I had not tried the weed before, But during the 2 fine English summers that he was with me, I must have smoked it every day. Our favourite place was a corner of the heath. There we would lie, flat on our backs in the sunshine. Often I had the sensation that I was floating as though on a magic carpet.
His father was living in the New Forest somewhere, and so Bante would go and see his dad and then come on to Bournemouth and spend the weekend with us. It was fantastic. I think his father would have lived quite a long time had it not been for his war wounds. But it wasn't all that long after I met Bante. His dad died.
He'd put on a very quiet, peaceable front. He used to make little sculptures out of pottery, and they were always very, very full of pain, you know, very painful images. And I think he expressed a lot of anguish through that side of him, but he was very good at, you know, shielding it.
All the time I knew him, he was with his girlfriend, Mafalda, a Portuguese lady, very nice lady. Nearly all the time from 1968, he was living with Mafalda at her flat and only went back to Highgate West Hill occasionally.
I did go and have a meal at Bante's place. There was about 4 of us that were invited, and Terry and his girlfriend Mafalda were there. I think they actually did the cooking.
On the 2nd of May, a dedication ceremony was followed by a celebration of Wesak. A dozen or so people stayed on afterwards, among them my English mystical school of painting friends and their respective girlfriends. The music went on, hour after hour, until some of us went into a sort of trance or fell asleep. In the morning we set out for Glastonbury. "Where are all those people going?" asked Carter, his eyes goggling. "They're all going to work," I explained. "They should all be on the beach," was his reply.
Bante was very, very close to Carter. That was really clear. And Carter, of course, had a girlfriend.
A few weeks after moving in with me, Carter had complained that I did not go out and about with him very often. I spent much of my time at my desk, which was the truth. I therefore told Carter that he should find a girlfriend. I was quite happy that Carter should sleep with Anthea, but Anthea was not happy that Carter should sleep with me or see very much of me.
That was eventually a cause of friction and why the relationship between Carter and Bante broke down.
Anthea had an upstairs room not far from where I lived. On one of the rare occasions when the 3 of us went for a walk together, he put an arm round each of us and declared that it was the happiest time of his life. He had with him the 2 people whom he loved best in the world. Terry had started to see Dr. David Cooper again, but neither his sessions with Cooper nor the antidepressants did him much good. There was only one alternative, he declared, that he should be enabled to re-enter the pure white light. With this end in view, he asked Cooper to give him LSD. Cooper agreed, but insisted that he took it under medical supervision, rather than together with Mafalda, his girlfriend, at her flat. The result of the LSD trial was that he experienced nothing. This finally convinced him that he could hope to see the pure white light only at the moment of death, and that he had no choice, therefore, but to commit suicide. More than once, having taken the meditation class at Sakura, I walked up the hill from the bus stop, not knowing whether on my arrival at the flat I would find Terry alive or dead. I was unable to share my concerns with any of our friends. as he was adamant that no one should know he was the victim of depression. My diary. Terry very low all day. Found him collapsed on the stairs. From friends of friends, I learnt that Carter had married Anthea and had taken her back to California with him. Before leaving, he sent me a message. "I know I'm hurting you. Give me 2 years and I'll be back." I was indeed hurt. Carter had been an important part of my life. It took me a long time to recover from the loss, but recover I did and was soon finding consolation elsewhere.
Madam Chairman and friends, in the course of these next 8 weeks, we shall be concerned with what is possibly the most important subject that we could, in fact, ever concern ourselves with.
I was looking for someone to teach me meditation. I mentioned it to my karate teacher and he said, "Oh, there's this monk giving some lectures in Kensington." So I went along and listened to Bhante giving the first of the Eightfold Path lectures that he gave. At the end of that, I went and spoke to him about meditation and he invited me to Sakura another evening of the week and taught me meditation. I can remember coming out of meditation with this great big grin on my face, a big smile, just feeling so good, the change that had taken place as a result of meditating. So I kept that up
and 85 people, including Terry and Mafalda, attended the retreat.
I do remember him being on retreat. He was always very quiet. He had a lovely energy. I mean, he really was a very lovely man. I just remember him being very quiet and just walking around, usually with a smile and kindly.
John Hipkin and our other friends were shocked to see how ill Terry looked, for by this time he had given up trying to conceal his condition.
Just very sad what happened, very sad.
The retreat ended on Sunday the 13th of April, and after the puja, Terry, Mafalda and I left for London in the little bus. Halfway through the journey, Terry suddenly declared that he felt like driving at top speed into the nearest brick wall and killing all 3 of us. And for a few minutes it seemed that he might actually do this. After dropping me at Highgate West Hill, he drove on with Mafalda to Islington. At 10 o'clock the next morning, I received a visit from 2 uniformed police officers. I knew at once what this meant. Terry had died 2 hours earlier, they informed me. He had died at Kentish Town Underground Station, having apparently thrown himself under an approaching train.
I don't know how Bhante studied, actually, because he was his closest friend, really. So, yeah, very, very difficult to, just when he was starting the new movement going as well. It must have been very, very hard for him. But he didn't talk about it very much.
For 2.5 days after Terry's death, heard him calling me and felt him pulling. At some point I went to Kentish Town Underground Station, stood on the edge of the platform as Terry had done, and tried to imagine what it had been like for him as he waited for the train.
My greatest fear is that I shall live after this event. If this should happen, please make something possible.
His biggest regret was that he never lived to bring all his energy and love, which he believed to have been quite considerable, into being. He also asked me to look after Mafalda as best I could, and he expressed his conviction.
I believe we could have worked miracles together on this earth. We will always be together. What happiness. Yours ever, T.
Bante didn't talk about it that much. He would have kept it very quiet. But I know he was really, really upset. And I know he would have done anything he could to have helped Terry. They had a very, very close relationship.
I get the feeling that here was the seed, if you like, of the future flourishing of the importance of Kalyana Mitrata in Bante's teaching and in the movement. That's my impression, coming fresh from a reading of that book and knowing what he said to me about Terry at the time and meeting Terry. It was a very, very powerful experience.
A lesson to be drawn from the events of the last 6 months had reference to a matter of general interest. The trouble, as I've called it, had started with gossip about my relationship with Terry. That relationship, it was alleged, was of a homosexual nature, and as Christmas Humphreys had pointed out, the English middle-class mind had an abhorrence of homosexuality. So great was that abhorrence that even the appearance of homosexuality was sufficient, it seemed, to warrant a man's banishment from decent society, or, as I had found, his removal from the position he occupied. What this meant in effect, at least in England, was that it was difficult for men to develop more than ordinarily close friendships without incurring the suspicion of homosexuality, and in some cases the unpleasant and even painful consequences of such suspicion. But friendship occupied an important place in Buddhism, the Buddha having gone so far as to declare, on one occasion, that spiritual friendship, Kalyana Mitrata, was not the half, but the whole of the spiritual life, Brahmacharya. Middle-class fear or hatred of homosexuality thus stood in the way of the full practice of the Dharma. The lesson I drew from this circumstance was that our new Buddhist movement would have to be free from homophobia, as it came to be called, if spiritual friendship was to flourish within it. Indeed, it would have to be free from homophobia if it was to be truly Buddhist. Buddhism was a universal teaching, and as such its attitude was one of goodwill, metta, towards all living beings, irrespective of race, nationality, social position, gender, or sexual orientation. Ruth Walsh died not many years later, and Morris soon remarried. After his retirement, he spent the rest of his long life producing a scholarly new translation of the Digha Nikaya, and campaigning against me and the FWBO. The monk who conducted his funeral service humorously remarked that he knew he was dead because when he bent over him and whispered Sangharakshita in his ear, he did not react. My prediction regarding Christmas Humphreys, that given time he would see the absurdity of his position and perform a volte-face, did not have to wait long for its fulfilment. Within weeks of my return to England, he was making friendly overtures to me, overtures to which I did not immediately respond.